Hello, welcome to Tomb of the Topstones. This will be a continuing video series exploring the world of Topstone masks. Our first mask is arguably the most famous and most significant Topstone mask, and that is the mask commonly known as the Shock Monster. It was not originally known as the Shock Monster. It was originally called Horror. Just one word, simply Horror. Later, it was dubbed Horror Zombie, but Topstone itself never referred to the mask as the Shock Monster. One could argue that the Topstone caveman or gorilla were more omnipresent during the 50s and 60s and perhaps are more significant to the history of the company than the Shock Monster. But unlike the gorilla and caveman, the Shock Monster has really transcended the company. People who don't know what Topstone is know what the Shock Monster is. It's had a life beyond the Topstone Mask Company. It's had a life beyond mask enthusiasts. It's entered the popular culture. You see the Shock Monster character used in products to this day, unauthorized. They're not paying the estate of Keith Ward anything for this. But you see a lot of knockoff products that use the likeness of the Shock Monster. You see all kinds of t-shirts and advertising. You see stock illustration art. There was even a zombie on The Walking Dead based on the Shock Monster. So the character has really lived on in the hearts and minds of monster kids in a way that no other Topstone character has. You also see a lot of independent mask makers trying their hand at doing their version of a Shock Monster. It really is a rite of passage. If you make latex masks today, sooner or later, you're going to do a Shock Monster. The name Shock Monster was created by James Warren, publisher of Famous Monsters of Filmland. The Topstone masks were advertised in Famous Monsters, and Mr. Warren thought that the name Horror really didn't sell the mask. The Topstone Mask Company was based in Bethel, Connecticut. It changed locations throughout its history, but during the period when the Shock Monster was being produced, the main location was Bethel. The company was founded in 1946 and continued producing masks through the early 1990s, when it was sold to the Paper Magic Group. During the 1950s, the company was owned by famed illustrator Keith Ward. Ward sculpted all of the masks made by Topstone throughout the 1950s, including the Shock Monster. It's not known exactly when the Shock Monster was introduced, but probably 1955 or 56. The earliest catalog reference that has been found so far to the Shock Monster comes from 1956, but it could have dated back earlier than that. Some people believe that the monster in the movie I Was a Teenage Frankenstein served as the inspiration for Keith Ward's Shock Monster. In fact, it seems more likely that the movie was inspired by Keith Ward. The movie I Was a Teenage Frankenstein was released in 1957, but we know that the Shock Monster mask was available at least as early as 1956. The resemblance could be a coincidence, or perhaps the filmmakers were inspired by the Topstone mask. We'll get into the origins of the Shock Sculpt a little later. First, let's take a look at the different styles of Shock Monster masks that Topstone made over the years. What you're looking at now is a modern reproduction of the Topstone Shock Monster mask. This is a modern pull made from a mold that was made from the original urethane rubber master. Keith Ward sculpted the Topstone masks in clay, and from that sculpt made a urethane rubber positive master. About 15 years ago, there was an historic find of dozens of urethane masters for almost all of the major Topstone mask characters. It is because of the discovery of these urethane masters that we have so many of the major Topstone masks available today as modern pulls. This pull was made by VXX Effects. It is number 20 of a 20-piece limited edition made a few years ago. It's called the Deluxe Shock. VXX Effects is an independent mask maker. He creates original masks, he sculpts masks, but he also specializes in making pulls from new plaster molds made from vintage original Topstone masters. This video is going to focus on the official releases of the Shock Monster. So the rest of the masks that you see in this video are masks that were officially produced and sold by the Topstone company in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. This is an actual vintage production example of the Shock Monster. This is the blue-haired version, which was introduced around 1970. This is not a modern pull or a reproduction. This is an actual vintage Topstone mask that was produced 40 years ago. The original Shock Monster probably had black hair based on illustrations in the catalogs and all of the photographic evidence, the vintage photos we have today. But the most iconic look today is arguably the blue-haired version. When you see Shock Monster depicted in popular culture, often people go for the blue hair. This is, as far as I know, the only existing example of this mask that has surfaced up to this point, October 2017. There are only 3 known examples of vintage Keith Ward Shock Monsters. This blue one, a white-haired one that you're about to see, and a black-haired one. I own 2 of the 3 examples that the mask community knows about. To say that this is an historic mask is an understatement. This is one of the most iconic monster masks ever made. Here you see the Keith Ward skull next to the Shock Monster. Keith Ward introduced the skull in the 1950s, and this particular example was probably made in the 1950s, and I say that because of the color of the paint. The reason I'm showing these 2 iconic masks next to each other is to illustrate the origin of the Shock Monster. You can see from examining the sculpt of the skull that it has the identical, not similar, but identical bone structure in the nose, the brow, the mouth, the teeth. It's not just similar to the Shock Monster, it's the same sculpture. Most likely, Keith Ward sculpted the skull first and then sculpted the Shock Monster, the riding zombie, over the skull. It's possible he sculpted Shock first and then reduced it to the skull, but that seems less likely. This is the white-haired Shock Monster. As far as I know, there are no vintage photos of this variation. This vintage example is the only evidence that it exists. I'm not sure when this was made. I'm guessing 1970s. I'm guessing because it has hair under its chin, like a beard, that it could have had some tie-in with the bicentennial. I'm thinking Uncle Sam. You can imagine this as a kind of horror version of Uncle Sam. That's pure speculation. The detail on this example is exceptional. The detail stands out much better than on my blue-haired version. You can really see the Keith Ward sculpt on this white-haired version. You can see all the details. It's almost as good as the VXX modern version that I showed earlier. These two shocks look very different from the Keith Ward version, but they are both official, legitimate Topstone shock monsters. Though I don't know for sure, I believe that the one on the left is the earlier version. Sometime around the late 70s or the early 80s, Topstone redesigned all of their classic masks. They maintained the same characters, but they updated the Keith Ward sculpts. They added texture to the skin, they added extra details. In some cases, the changes were subtle. In other cases, like this shock monster, the changes were more extreme. This shock is essentially a brand new sculpt. It was probably sculpted over the Keith Ward original. Topstone did this simply to freshen up their line. They did it to compete with other masks that were being made at the time that had a different style. They wanted to make their mask look more modern. The mask on the right is probably late 80s, heading into the early 90s. You can see that by now, the last vestiges of the Keith Ward sculpt are almost gone. It really bears very little resemblance to the Keith Ward original, but you can still tell that it's the same character. Looking at the shock on the left, if the color looks kind of strange, that's because the mask has turned hard. And I've seen examples of this mask in other collections, and it is prone to discolor over time and turn hard. There's a darker variation of this sculpt. It's more of an avocado color. It's painted a little differently. Instead of this airbrushed look, it's more hand painted. And that darker version tends to hold up a little better over time. With the mask on the right, I have another version that has glow-in-the-dark paint, but I'm not certain if that version was actually made by Topstone. This version is, it has a Topstone copyright on it. The other one, the glow one that I have, might have been a bootleg. This is a Vacuform plastic Topstone shock monster. Topstone produced most of their major characters in plastic versions. These were made from the very same sculpts as the rubber ones. The Vacuform versions are full size. They are 1-to-1, identical with the rubber ones. Like a Ben Cooper mask, they're held on to the face using an elastic band. This is the only example that I've ever seen of a legitimate Topstone Vacuform shock monster. And this only surfaced in the last year. Prior to that, many people speculated as to whether or not Topstone produced the shock in plastic. I think it's likely that all the characters that have yet to turn up in plastic versions are out there somewhere. That concludes our exploration of the Topstone shock monster. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting. My goal is to continue this series and take a look at some of the other iconic Topstone masks, such as the caveman, the gorilla, the devil, the cyclops, the female vampire, etc. So until next time, for the Tomb of the Topstones, this is Raymond Castile. Bye-bye.